the green one. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to shift gears quite a bit because I'm going to be talking about a very small number of very heterogeneous patients and the difficulties we have in trying to get good guidelines for their care. The field is congenital heart surgery, and most of the patients are pediatric patients. So just for perspective, randomized clinical trials in our particular area have been the gold standard for evidence-based medicine, but they have important shortcomings, which has led to an interest in data registries to answer questions regarding outcomes and best practices. I'd like to outline the strengths and limitations of randomized clinical trials within our field and give a sample of some of the significant trials, the strengths and limitations of registries, and a sample of some significant registry data, and then merging data, and again, some landmark advances within our field. So the strengths of clinical trials, obviously, they're designed to answer a specific question or a specific aim, and the subjects are randomized to the intervention. The weakness is it's not inclusive. It requires consent, and therefore not all patients are included. Complications, particularly in our field, are practice pattern variation, and the practice pattern caring for these patients wildly varies between institutions, and then they're challenged by funding. I'm part of a double-blind study to see how weight loss supplements help people lose weight. I guess I'm on the sugar pill placebos. And just a comment, particularly in pediatrics, it's very difficult to get consent. In this Harris poll in 2004, only 1 in 4 parents in the United States would consider allowing their child to participate in research. And I believe that this also introduces bias to the results of the clinical trials. Funding for clinical trials in our field are primarily pharmaceutical agencies, and if you want to do a large trial, you're really limited to the NIH. In 1997, the FDA had the Modernization Act. So this is an act where pharmaceutical companies can propose and fund a prospective randomized clinical trial that addresses the safety and efficacy of a drug in pediatrics. The FDA will approve the trial, and if it's completed, then the company gets a 6-month patent extension. So examples in our field of these type of trials were the MILRINONE trial for low cardiac output, esmolol for controlling heart block after coarctation repair, PLAVIX for patients with shunts, and carvedilol in patients with heart failure. Just a couple key studies. Probably the biggest one in our field was the PRIMACORE study. This was sponsored by Santa Fe Syntheto Labs, looking at MILRINONE as a means of reducing low cardiac output syndrome following surgery. Patients less than 6 months after heart surgery, less than 6 months of age at the time of heart surgery were included. It was 31 centers, and the primary outcome was they did find a reduction in cardiac output using MILRINONE. MILRINONE is now relatively standard in our field for low cardiac output following this study. But the study did not allow MILRINONE to be FDA approved in pediatrics. Another important study was the CLARINET study, which is using PLAVIX. This was funded by Bristol Myers Squibb. In 2006 to 10, there were 31 centers and nearly 1,000 subjects, which is a big trial for our field. The primary outcome was a composite of death, shunt thrombosis, and you can see in the diagram there the shunt is a conduit between the innominate artery and the pulmonary artery, which is how the blood flow goes to the lungs. So shunt thrombosis or an intervention over concerns of shunt narrowing within 3 months after the shunt was placed. 88% of the patients were receiving aspirin, and because the trial did not want to change institutional standard of care, that's why so many patients received aspirin, and because those patients were on aspirin, there was no difference in the primary outcome with regards to the PLAVIX. There was also no complications that were seen. What's interesting is at that time, Bristol Myers Squibb sales for under patent were $5 billion a year. They paid $1,000 per patient, so the cost of the trial was $1 million, and with a 6-month patent extension, they gained $2.5 billion. All right, this is my only Trump slide of the entire conference. But with regards to NIH funding, President Trump's 2018 budget request delivered to Congress called a New Foundation for American Greatness as proposing a $6 billion cut to NIH funding. So moving to clinical, or moving to NIH-funded trials, there's really two important ones in our field. One is the THAPCA trial. This is funded by the NHLBI, and basically what they were looking at was comparing hypothermia to normothermia for the first 48 hours after cardiac arrest. There were two fairly equivalent papers. The first one, which came out in 2015 in New England Journal, looked at patients who had an out-of-house cardiac arrest, and the second one, which came out this year, looked at patients who had an in-house cardiac arrest. Bottom line is there was no difference between those two strategies with regards to survival or neurologic status. What's really interesting here, which I'd like to point out, is the problem with consent in pediatrics. If you look once they'd excluded the patients that didn't meet exclusion criteria and the ones they didn't approach, 27% in the first study the parents refused consent, and in the in-house study 40% of the parents refused consent. So this does really make the clinical trials a problem in pediatrics. The second trial, which is one that I was intimately involved in, is the first ever clinical trial which randomizes a surgical technique in congenital heart surgery. This also was funded by the NHLBI, which has a subgroup which is called the Pediatric Heart Network. So basically patients with something called hypoplastic left heart syndrome have to undergo a palliative surgery in the newborn stage before they can go home. Traditionally, that surgery had a shunt put in from the innominate artery to the pulmonary artery, which was described by Bill Norwood in 1983. In 2003, Sunji Sano in Japan described putting the shunt from the right ventricle directly to the pulmonary artery. So the study was to randomize the patients to these two approaches. The primary outcome was transplant-free survival at 1 year, and the RV to PA, the direct conduit from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, had better survival. The secondary outcome, which was an extension of the study, was at 3 years we relooked at these patients, and at that time there was no difference between the two shunts. This particular study had one of the best consent rates, and only 14% of the parents refused to consent. So lessons that we learned, or I learned from the SVR trial, is the protocol that you're going to implement in your trial needs to minimally impact the site practice. Otherwise, the surgeons won't enroll and the site won't enroll patients. Pilot trials are extremely necessary, especially if you're going to do something complex like a surgical procedure. Equipoise is important for participation in all centers. In our particular study, there was equipoise within institutions, but in fact, there were some surgeons who had only done one shunt and not the other when they started enrolling patients. Funding is vital, and in this particular study, the NIH didn't have enough funding to go and audit the data collection at the individual sites, and I think that's very important. Practice pattern variation confounded our data analysis, and we didn't anticipate this. And almost every data analysis we did on the primary outcomes and subsequent outcomes, the center was an independent risk factor for nearly every analysis we looked at. Informed consent is very time-consuming. I personally consented 95 of 500 patients in the study, and the average consent time took me about 2.5 hours. And then there's a conflict of interest if the intensivist or the surgeon participates in any way in the study. And although we tried to avoid that, I think that's why this study had one of the highest consent rates. So this is just a slide to just show the practice pattern variation, how much that impacted our trial. You can see the factors are listed on the left here, and then on the right is the range, which is the median in each particular center, and there were, I think, 15 centers in this study. So for some things like whether or not they came out of the operating room with an open sternum, it varied from 35% to 100%. Well, that's like a really important risk factor in whether or not you're going to survive. Similarly, the use of ECMO varied from 7% to 35%. So within the individual centers, the way they were practicing had almost a stronger impact on the mortality than what shunt was re-randomized to. So the strength, let me shift, so basically, I think as a field, and me personally, we were very involved in randomized clinical trials. And with the data analysis for the SVR trial, I think people lost a lot of faith, and it's also difficult to get these trials off the ground. So at the same time, a lot of emphasis was put into data registries. So from my point of view, the strength of the data registry is it's inclusive of all patients. We can get a larger number of patients. The cost is distributed across the institutions because it's generally considered a QI initiative, so the institutions themselves pay to submit the data because it allows them to get risk-adjusted benchmarking compared to other institutions. The weaknesses are that it's not developed to answer a specific clinical question. And so analysis of data registry data to look at a question often lacks key granular data that you really wanted to answer your question. There's also many subspecialty registries. There's a cath registry, there's an ICU registry, there's a surgical registry, and at current they're not really linked together. In addition, there are administrative databases which have non-granular data, but those are not audited databases. So let me just point out a few key registry studies that have come out that I think have made an impact in our field. All of these are from the Society of Thoracic Surgeons registry. So one was looking at surgical outcomes based on the volume of the center. And basically what was found was that lower volume centers had a higher mortality, which isn't too surprising. But what was surprising was that the center volume was not associated with a number of postoperative complications, but it was the high volume centers that could resuscitate the patient from the complication and avoid the mortality. A second study looked at the impact of preterm delivery on mortality after newborn heart surgery. And obviously, so on the graph, you'll see that everything's compared to 39.5 weeks gestation. These are all babies who had surgery within the first 30 days of birth. And the gestational ages with the stars on them are significantly different mortality compared to 39.5. So it's not surprising that a 34-weeker might not do as well as a 39.5, but the fact that a 37-weeker has a higher mortality, that was new news. And this actually changed our field in such a way that previously patients where the mother is known to have a baby with congenital heart disease were often delivered a little bit early, but in a controlled setting, potentially by C-section, and now that practice has changed to let the baby go to term. And then finally, there is the impact of solumedrol. It's sort of standard in our field over the years is to give a large dose of solumedrol to the patients, particularly the newborns on pump, to try to reduce inflammation. So they looked at 4,000 patients, 62% of which received steroids, and in this large registry data, which is actually a really interesting study because they not only took the STS surgical registry, but they linked it with the Pediatric Health Information System, which is a large administrative database. And they used that by using patient identifiers in such a way that they were able to link 90% of the patients. And so from the FIS database, they got who got solumedrol, and from the STS database, they had the diagnosis and surgical risk, so it was all risk stratified. And basically, they found there was no difference in mortality or length of stay for the patients that got solumedrol, and that actually is sort of our field has sort of gotten away from using solumedrol because of that. So putting it all together, as Einstein said, if you always do what you always did, then you always get what you always got. And I just want to say one thing before I wrap up with the difference between registries and clinical trials, and that's innovation. And the major breakthroughs in our field have all been innovation. Specifically, in 1945, Blaylock and Taussig and Thomas put the first shunt in a baby with tetralogy, and suddenly babies with tetralogy could grow and not be as cyanotic. And in 1954, Walt Lillehei connected a one-year-old baby to the parent, where the parent was the bypass machine, and they used cross circulation. He did the first intracardiac repair of a VSD. For transposition, prior to 1950s, nobody survived with transposition. In the early 1960s, Senning and Mustard figured out how to switch the flow so that the atrial flow was switched. But still, these babies died young because since they had parallel circulation, there wasn't enough mixing, and so a lot of these patients died really young. And in 1966, Rashkin put a balloon up there and ripped a hole in the atrial septum, and suddenly all these patients could live long enough to have surgery. In 1975, they figured out you could give them prostaglandins, and now the duct stays open and they could live even longer. And in 1975, even though the Mustard and Senning, the atrial switch procedure, had a 99% survival, Jantine decided he was going to switch to two great arteries so that your ventricles will be the appropriate ventricle for your systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation. There was no IRB, there was no approval. The mortality went from 99% to close to 50%, survival went from 90% to close to 50% for the first 10 years until the surgeons figured out how to do that, and now that's the standard of care. For hypoplastic left heart syndrome, there were no survivors before 1983. In 1983, Norwood was able to do a stage 1 and transition that patient all the way through to a Fontan. That patient ended up growing and doing nicely. In 1985, Leonard Bailey did the first human heart transplant in a baby with hypoplastic left heart syndrome and went on to do 500 transplants in children afterwards. And by 1990, the Norwood survival was now 90%, up from 0% almost 10 years before. And my young patient, 8 years of age, who would have been dead if she was born before 1980, is now a healthy 12-year-old. So in summary, innovations have historically made the greatest contributions to improve survival in congenital heart disease. The major breakthroughs often you'll find in the literature followed many failed attempts, and these are usually on patients who otherwise would have died. So one questions whether informed consent and the IRB process may stifle innovation to some degree. Randomized clinical trials are designed to be the most rigorous way to answer a specific question, but in our population they're hindered by a heterogeneous patient population, practice pattern variation, and difficult getting consent to include all patients. So multi-center databases are probably the way of the future, even for evidence-based medicine. The data to answer specific questions is probably going to need to be prospectively collected. You can use the registry data now to look retrospectively, figure out what the data is you're missing, and then set up a prospective trial through that same system. And most importantly, linkage between the data registries is going to be crucial for the future. Thank you very much.